TANTV Talks are interactive virtual discussions conducted by TANTV journalists in collaboration with prominent figures from the diaspora. The primary objective of this segment is to provide a meaningful platform for engaging conversations to occur. TANTV Talks features diverse areas of study and invites experts and intellectuals with specialized knowledge, fostering engaging interactions with interested audiences. Today's TANTV Talk is going to be with Lauren Washington. Lauren Washington is a trailblazing entrepreneur and visionary leader who has made a lasting mark on the tech and startup industry. As a co-founder of several groundbreaking initiatives, she has been instrumental in fostering innovation, diversity, and equity within the technology ecosystem. In 2017, Lauren co-founded Black Women Talk Tech, a transformative organization with a mission to empower Black women in the entrepreneurial space. Under her leadership, the visionary movement quickly evolved into the largest conference dedicated to Black women founders. In 2019, Lauren co-founded Fundr, the groundbreaking platform revolutionizes seed investing by automating the process. Her remarkable journey has been featured in leading publications such as the Business Journal, TechCrunch, Forbes, and Essence.
And we're just going to sort of hear a bit from Lauren about her background and how you got into the business of talking about Black women in tech, Black founders, and how you even evolved to launching a tech platform called Fundr. So I'll pass it on to you, Lauren. Would love to hear more from you on your background.
Yeah, of course. So it's a little bit of a windy road, I would say, in terms of how I got to where I'm at. When I graduated from undergrad, I went into I actually did Teach for America first, and then I went into marketing. I worked at InStyle and TV Guide and helped with their social media and online marketing and like the very early advent of those types of marketing channels. I then went back to get my MBA at Northwestern Kellogg School of Management. And then when I came out of that, I went into the agency side. So during that time, I worked with probably over 100 different companies working on their brand strategy and particularly using data to pull out insights from social media. So after that, I decided to start my first company, which was called Keep Up. And we won the 43 North competition in Buffalo, New York. And that just sort of kicked off my time here in the tech space. And I was brand new. I had no idea how to navigate this industry. It was completely different from being on the corporate side in terms of language, in terms of process, in terms of norms. And so I really struggled, particularly with the fundraising piece in terms of how to bring money into my company after winning this really big pitch competition. And what I found was that a couple of years later, I was not the only one who was struggling with this. I met other Black women in the industry and we started talking and sharing very similar stories. And that's what led to Black Women Talk Tech getting started was, okay, if we're having these similar experiences, let's get together in a room to talk about them. And during that time, the Project Diane report came out, which was the first report that actually put numbers to how much women were getting in terms of funding in the industry. And there were only 11 women at the time. This was back in, I think, 2016, this report came out. And only 11 women at the time who had raised $1 million. And the funding gap was huge. It was probably 0.35% of the funding went to Black women entrepreneurs. And so we started building this whole arm around how do we get education and funding and access to these women. And then after that, I realized that I think there was a larger systemic issue here that needs to be addressed, which is why I started Fundr. So maybe we can create a platform that allows people to understand how to remove bias while still using that data to make really good decisions about their investments long term. And so that's kind of the windy story of how I got here and what is really driving me. It's really my own experiences.
No, absolutely. What a journey, right? From Black women in tech, to launching Fundr. Personally, again, one of the reasons I wanted us to have this conversation is, as a Black founder, that challenge is still very, very, very real today. And even just seeing what's happening in the in the industry with the likes of Fearless Fund, what is happening right now. What can you say about this systemic issue of the challenges that Black women face in fundraising?
I will say, having been in this industry for 10 years, the challenges are pretty much the same. The funding gap has barely budged over the last 10 years. I think now there's about 100 recorded women who have brought in over $1 million. But when you think about that, that's really only 10 women every single year. And people are putting calls out. It's not that you don't have the information anymore. It's not that we don't know this is an issue. And when the 2020 social justice movement happened, and there were a lot of commitments that went around that, I think there was some excitement in the industry that we could start making some headways. But when we look at the data this year, we found that only 1% of all those billions of dollars in commitments have actually been deployed. And a lot of that is just kind of sitting there and no one's doing anything with it. And correlating with that, we've also seen the numbers that had peaked around 2020, 2021 for funding going to Black women dropped back to exactly where they were, and actually worse a couple of months ago. So the funding went down, I believe, about 50% for Black founders, and it's below where it was in 2020. So I think it becomes really difficult when you're trying to fight this type of issue when you're not seeing really any progress. Now, anecdotally, there's a ton of progress. I know a lot of Black women who've raised. We have now Black women who have billion-dollar companies, which is for the first time ever that Black women are creating billion-dollar tech companies. But overall, we've made very, very little progress despite a lot of calls to action.
It's interesting you touch on the fact that the funding scale has reduced compared to 2020. Given that you're an expert, I don't want to be the expert here, but given that you're an expert, take us through the idea of what happened in 2020, why it went up and going down, and then also perhaps tying into what's going on with Fearless Fund, for instance.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what happened in 2020 was after the social justice movement, there were a lot of people within the VC space, corporations, venture firms who felt like we need to start putting more funding into Black entrepreneurs. All of a sudden, people understood what we've been kind of like screaming from the rooftops for years. I think a lot of that, unfortunately, ended up being performative, that they felt like they had to say something and do something because people were individually calling out specific companies during that time for not engaging. And what ended up happening was after a couple of years, when all of that really died down on the national stage, at least, I think there was less action towards actually deploying that cash. There are some really great companies who did it. Google has been incredible in terms of how they are deploying their cash. But on the whole, it seems like most of that money was just performative. What we see with Fearless Fund also brings in a really concerning angle to this, because what's happening in that case is the person who is suing them is basically saying that you can't use race or gender or anything in terms of being able to give out. He's specifically going after grants.
We invest in high-growth, scalable companies that have women of color co-founders.
That's the mission of Fearless Fund in a nutshell. And now that mission is being challenged by the conservative nonprofit group, the American Alliance for Equal Rights. They filed suit against Fearless Fund, saying it violates civil rights law, prohibiting racial discrimination in contracts, because one of its grant programs is specifically for Black women.
But obviously, this has wider implications that any institution that's using demographics, particularly for underrepresented people, to make business decisions are not going to be able to do that anymore. So it's beyond just Fearless Fund. It's for the whole VC industry, and it's for really any type of organization could be impacted by that. And it's really unfortunate when you pair those two things together, and we know the stats that these $10,000 grants are often the only thing that Black women are getting in terms of funding. So to come and attack something like that when we have such deep bias and there's such a deep gap in terms of how much funding we're getting is really detrimental and could be catastrophic for entrepreneurs here in the States.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find it personally ridiculous to go after this agenda, given that we're the minority in most of, if not all, the spaces, and the gap in funding is ridiculous. And something I've been saying lately is that we are over-mentored and underfunded. They give, white folks, my words, are being given money to fail forward, so to say. It's like, yeah, take this money, go experiment. Even if your idea is on a piece of tissue paper, we trust you enough to go. But when we come up with even more than proof of concept, more than MVP, then we're being told, more mentorship, and then we'll think about the funding. What is let's talk about Fundr, for instance. What is this platform aiming to really achieve and disrupt in this terrible ecosystem, I would say?
Yeah, we're going directly at funding because, like you said, even with a lot of these commitments that came out years ago, of the money that's been deployed, most of it has gone to programming and education for founders. So like you said, it's mentorship programs, it's accelerators that don't come with money. And you can be over mentored, right? At some point, I can learn everything I can, but if the system is working against me, it doesn't matter. If the people who are in charge and have power don't make those changes, then what I learned doesn't make a difference at all. And so what we're doing here is really trying to provide those who are making the funding decisions with the data that they need in terms of optimizing their overall process so that they can remove bias. So if they have this data and they understand, looking at their pipeline, how many Black women have gone through their pipeline and that they've invested in, and how many have they said no to? And then those that they've said no to, are they similar to the other companies that you said yes to? And is the only reason you said no then because of their race and gender? That opens up a lot of change. And then where within this pipeline are they getting stuck? Is it at the initial introduction? Is it at the pitch stage? Is it at the negotiation? And once you understand those things, then you can make those changes. The reason why we created it this way, and we've gone through some iterations here, but we've talked to so many investors, and I think there are some really great investors with good intentions who understand that, oh, we have an issue. I know there's a funding gap, obviously, if I'm in the space, but I don't know how to change it. I've tried other things. I don't know how to do it. And we all have unconscious bias. But when you put data to remove that unconscious bias, you're able to really then make decisions that shift your thinking versus leaning only on your experience and your history and the biases that you're bringing to the table.
If I read correctly, and forgive me if I'm mixing things up, but there was a competition that happened where your platform was able to predict the winner, and it took 6 hours for the judges to decide on the winner, but your platform was able to predict. Can you sort of shed more light about that process?
Yeah, and we've done that a few times actually. So we've been able to identify top companies with our platform while still removing bias. And the reason why we can do that is because we've really dove deep into the research around what makes a great company. So if you've been an investor for a really long time, you're doing these in your head anyway, right? You're kind of mapping what's the traction, what's the revenue, what's the team look like? But you're also doing that with this angle, like I mentioned, in terms of, does this match in terms of like pattern matching to stuff I've seen that is successful, right? And oftentimes when it comes to the founder, what you've seen is white men being successful in this industry. Like that's just who's getting most of the money. And so it's sort of what we're doing is removing that piece and saying, let's get down to the fundamentals and look at this actual business and see if this is something that could be viable long-term, removing that founder from that process. And we've been able to replicate decisions that seasoned investors are making because, like I said, they're doing these calculations in their head. If you've been in the industry for a long time, but we're providing that to make it a lot faster and also providing it for anyone to be able to use this tool to help make decisions.
Yes. So for instance, there's a startup that has been looking for funding. I mean, startups are always trying to find funding. You're always trying to go after the money. How can they sort of get on your platform? How can they make the best use of it? Or is it open to founders, or is it just open to VCs? How does that work?
It is open to founders. So any founders can come on. We'll look at your overall application and your data room, and then add you onto the platform or not, depending on where you're at and if we think it's a right fit for the investors that we have. Our main focus, though, is on the investing group. So we work with VC funds, accelerators, angel groups, family offices, and are helping them mostly with their process. But those groups really want deal flow. So that's why we're bringing in additional companies to our platform to sort of match them to each other and provide that deal flow for them.
Okay, so if I'm getting this correctly, so founders can get on the platform and sort of build their own data room, put all the information that it would normally have in their data room on your platform, and then it opens up to investors in that take a look at the companies there. So how do the companies actually get funded? What is that process like? Because I think I read that in terms of like raising, you said you selected 15 companies at the moment, and kind of just explain that. I don't want to mince words.
Yeah, and our business model has shifted a little bit. So prior to what we're doing now, we were creating essentially like profiles or portfolios of companies like a 401k that individual investors can invest in. We still allow individual investors and investing groups. We have about 500 of them that are approved on our platform and a few thousand that are on our email list that we send these deals out to, so they can still invest through our platform. But we have shifted to serve the investors, mostly because we want to go in and be able to change their processes and make a difference in their process. What we have seen is that a lot of these equity crowdfunding platforms still have that same bias. So yes, I think there's a lot of, you're much more likely to be able to fundraise if you are a Black woman or a founder of color or underrepresented founder on these equity platforms, but there's still a significant amount of bias that comes into play for that. And most of the time, once you've gone to equity crowdfunding, it's because you have not been able to raise in others, right? And so you're usually getting smaller rounds on those platforms than you would if you were able to go out and do this. So what we're trying to do is like really get to the deep root of the issue, which is within the process and the pipelines of these investors, and making changes that way.
What would you say to founders who are feeling unseen at the moment and feeling like, what the heck? Like, what's the point of being in this space where you see your white counterparts doing exact same thing as you are, and no one puts them in a box, right? Like, you enter the same space doing exact same thing, and it's like, for us, we get put in this box of social impact right away, or money, small grants or whatever, that is like, yeah, you deal with this. And then on the other side, the same exact idea, same exact phase, but then it's millions thrown, and millions that are just like, not even a bit, like if you had a portion of that, you would be trailblazing in full force. what do you have to say to founders who are just exhausted at the moment?
Yeah, I would say if you are really going down the VC route, firstly, know that you're not alone. I mean, I think that was the reason we started Black Women Talk Tech, was to make sure we were creating community and sharing our experiences. And so if you haven't talked to somebody else who is a Black founder who has fundraised, go find them, because you'll see that you're not alone. It's not just you. You're not a bad founder. You don't have a terrible company. There are larger things that are at play here that are playing into it. And sometimes that can help in terms of keeping you motivated and going. I would also say that know that your journey is going to be different. If you choose to go down this path, you are probably not going to send a deck out and raise $2 million in 2 weeks, right? Off of a pre-product. It's just probably not going to happen for you. I've never seen it happen. And so what you need to know is that it might take you 2 years to raise your pre-seed round or your seed round. I've seen that. And you might have to reach out to hundreds of investors to get the same amount of money. So going in knowing that shifts expectations around what your journey looks like. And then the third piece is, if you don't need to raise VC, then don't, right? This is not right for most types of businesses. Only 2% of all businesses actually get VC funding. And then if you make that even smaller in terms of the Black founders that are getting VC funding, it's tiny. It's handfuls of people every single year. And so if you can figure out a way to build your business through some other mechanism, some other type of funding, or just building it on your own and using revenue to keep that going, then I would also consider that, because you're putting yourself on a path that is going to be really risky, really hard, really tough anyway, even if you weren't a Black founder, and it'll be 10 times more if you are.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to, I have a question surrounding Black Women Talk Tech. Can you just kind of elaborate on the timeline and the growth of Black Women Talk Tech from its creation to, just today, I guess, just like how it's grown and expanded?
Yeah, of course. And so I'm not at Black Women Talk Tech full time anymore. I left in 2021 to work on Fundr full time. But when we started this in 2015, like I mentioned, I just met my co-founders, Asos and Regina, at conferences. And I, at that point, had never seen a Black woman at a conference that I was going to. And so we were so excited to meet each other. We ended up creating this retreat for, I think we had about 10 Black women founders in 2015. That was so eye-opening and so incredible that in 2017, we started our first conference. It really wasn't even meant to be a conference. It was just going to be a gathering of Black women founders. And we had 100 people who signed up for it in 2 weeks. We were turning people away at the door who weren't able to get in. And so we knew we were onto something. And the things that came out of that, people got funding, people found their co-founders, people started their own groups in other areas of the country. We knew this was going to be a movement after that happened. And so that ended up growing. We grew, pretty much doubled every year after that in terms of the amount of people who came to the conference. We then created chapters around the country, and in London, we expanded into Black Men Talk Tech as well. So they have their own arm, and Talk Tech Association, which is our nonprofit where we do research and additional work through that arm. And now I believe this year they are launching a London conference as well. So we've been able to really expand, because at that time, there was actually a speaker who said, this is radical that you're even talking about this, because nobody was talking about it in 2017. And that was only a couple of years ago. So I would say in terms of progress, we've made a lot of progress to have these conversations publicly about what our experiences are within this industry, which I think is making a difference. But I think that's why we were able to grow, because everyone was quietly having the same experiences, but we're not talking about it and figuring out ways to come together to make those changes. Mm-hmm.
And that was actually one of it leads me to the question I was going to ask, which is about community. What sort of community resources have you identified that Black founders can tap into for support and, mind growth and just like mental strength at this point.
Absolutely. There's so many communities. I was actually just thinking about this recently, how when we started, we were the only ones who were doing something like this. And there was Afrotech as well, who also touches on the founder community, but is more like Black tech overall. But it was really exciting to see how many conferences there are now, how many groups there are that are really focusing on this. I think there's probably a conference in every city once a week that's doing something around Black tech. And if it's not a large conference, then it's small groups that are getting together. And so I think really just doing a little bit of the work within your area around how you can get involved and get connected is really important. Here in Austin, where I live, I do a Black Founders Happy Hour that people come out to. I've been doing it for 2 years. And I think there's a lot of little movements like that that are happening in all different places where you can truly find your community and build up people that you trust, because it's everything in terms of being a founder. You're not going to make it if you don't have other founders around you to help support you.
I think I'm going to connect with you after this about Black Founders Happy Hour, and maybe we can have a spin-off over here in DC, because it's just always encouraging to be surrounded by other founders and all that, right? So I have 2 more questions, then we'll let you go because of time. But first, what I have in mind, okay, resources. What are some of the resources in terms of, I guess, fundraising, of course, in addition to Fundr, but other resources that you can sort of recommend for founders to look into?
Yeah, I am really big on reading and books. So that's where I get a lot of my information from. There's a number of books around fundraising that are out there. Get Backed is a great one that literally it's a picture book of pitch decks and shows you how to put your deck together. There's incredible books about the journey. Hard Thing About Hard Things is really incredible and talks about like the ups and downs of being an entrepreneur. Arlen Hamilton's book is really incredible to talk about it from the Black woman's perspective and what that looks like. And then I just continue to build around things that I need help with, whether it's sales or team or products, whatever I'm thinking about at the moment, I grab a book and read about. There's always some resource out there or some person out there who has gone through what you're going through. So don't feel like you have to struggle through something and how to figure it out. That's why I say tap your network and build that network, because even if you are on the same page and you're building at the same time, you're going through different things at different times and you're able to really help each other through that. So I'd say those are probably the biggest ones. Conferences really helped me in the early days kind of to make those connections and build my networks and hear panels and learn from other people. So definitely don't underestimate the value of conferences in the early days. Eventually, I think they're not as useful as you get older or later on into the business, but particularly in the early days, I think they're really helpful to kind of guide you into what you're building and give you resources in terms of how to get to that next phase.
I was listening to a podcast by the founders of the Scheme. I don't know if you've come across that platform, the 2 white women that founded it. And it's interesting the difference. For instance, they were asked similar question in the interview or something, and they said, "Oh, I don't read books at all. I don't read books at all. I just pick up the phone to call, and we just get the support." And that just makes me think of that difference in access when it comes to access of people who are there, quote unquote, that we need direct information from. We suffer in that access, if that makes any sense to what you just said.
Yeah. And I think the books piece for me, I'm just a lifelong learner in general, so I'm always going to read. But I think the piece was when I first started my first company, I didn't understand any of the lingo. I didn't understand any of this. And so even if I called someone for help, there's a certain barrier that you have to get over in terms of like, what kind of help am I asking for? Like, what am I even doing here before you even know to get someone involved to help you? So I think it's really useful to make sure that you're learning as much as possible. And there's so many resources out there right now, from books to blogs to videos around this industry that were not there in 2014. Now you can find everything that you need. And so I think doing that upfront work will help you when you make those connections to people to ask the right questions and use them in the right ways, versus kind of there's a certain amount of asks that you can have with somebody. So making sure you're utilizing and maximizing that, and maximizing your network is really, really important.
That leads me to the other question on transparency. How important is it for well, I guess would I say there are two parts to this. So white friends or white allies, how important is it for them to be transparent, and how can they sort of be supportive? I'm trying to find the best way to phrase it, of our experience and the hurdles and challenges, which is very real, in that sense. And then on the other hand, how important is it for us to be transparent with each other in the journey, the process of fundraising, the process of, things that we're talking about right now and all that.
That transparency is everything. Nothing is going to change if we can't really have real, vulnerable, transparent conversations. I think founders are really good at that, behind closed doors. They will tell you what they're going through. They will tell you their terms. If you build up connections with them, they really do want to help each other out. And the more you can share that kind of information, the better, right? Because that's power that I can go into when I'm raising my rounds, and I can understand what someone else has gotten in the same way with the same investor. I would say when it comes to allies and white founders or white investors, there's two different things. One is to listen to us and hear us and believe us, because I think sometimes the advice you get is, oh yeah, just go out and you go raise a quick $1 million and then you could do this and you don't even need a deck. That's not our experience. So really making sure that you're hearing us and problem solving with us, or even if it's not problem solving, it could just be sometimes we need an ear to hear us and listen to. And then the second piece is bringing us with you and bringing us into the rooms. That is so important. Don't close the door behind you. If you have gotten an investment and they're looking for other investors, bring your Black friends and make that introduction, or bring them to the investor dinner that's happening, or whatever it is, because we don't necessarily have that access. And so much of this industry is built on relationships and warm introductions. And so if it's really, like you said, I pick up the phone and it's a phone call away from me, imagine that it's probably 10 phone calls for a founder to get there. It's like I said, it's 10 times harder for me to get to that connection. So if you can open those doors and, pull up a seat at the table, that is everything. And that's going to make those changes.
I know I said I had two questions, but this is, we've passed two questions since I said that. But to wrap up, because everything sounds a bit heavy, I would say. And that's the reality, right? That's the ecosystem that we're in. We've always battled with it. We thought we saw some light from 2020, but now companies are like taking everything back and giving us black empty squares, like the incident that happened where it was like black squares. And it feels like we're living in just a black square era right now, where it's like, yeah, I'm just gonna make an impression as if we're doing something, but behind the scenes, nothing is really happening, right? But to wrap up, what is a sweet spot for you right now? What are you hopeful for? What should we be hopeful for as founders? And just something hopeful to leave us with.
Yeah. I think that's always great. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think that there was potential for change. I talk to so many investors who recognize this as an issue, not just Black investors, but white investors. They want to make these changes, but changes like this, I mean, if you're changing an industry and you're changing a system, this is not even systemic just within the industry, it's nationwide. I mean, we're built on slavery and we're built on racism. These are not things that are going to change in a couple of years. These are not things that are going to change in a decade. And so making sure that you're really honing in on the little wins that you're making and a little bit of progress, because it's going to be a marathon, is super important. And so for me, I get up every day and I feel like, okay, I've made a little bit of progress here. I've talked to someone who gets it and wants to make change, or is going to make that introduction for a Black founder, or you know, I've been able to help someone fundraise that wasn't able to fundraise for a couple of years. Those tiny things all add up over time in terms of changing your mentality and changing the overall landscape in the long run.